Welcome to the podcast today. I'm sitting here with Crystal. I'm excited to talk to her and hear a bit more about her and her business and her life right now. It's kind of crazy. And then I'll be sharing with her a bit about one of her ancestors, well, a couple of her ancestors. And so I'm excited to dive into this and excited for Crystal for making time to come on here and be on the podcast today. So first, Crystal, I would just want you to introduce yourself. Give us a little
Mhm.
intro, who you are, a bit about your family, and what you're doing right now.
So I'm super excited to be on. When you asked me, I was like, yes, I was already so interested in the work that you do. So I love it. My name is Crystal Haitsma. And yes, I'm typically the parenting coach. I still am, but I have been making some pivots in my business. So up until now, I've been doing a lot of connection-based parenting. So really helping people that struggle to parent in a different way than was passed down to them by, generations before. There's a new kind of way, I feel like it's a wave of the future of parenting with like relationship and
Mhm.
connection and dropping shame and fear and coercion and rewards and punishments and all the things that we've done in the past that we're realizing are not only not beneficial, but as adults now are actually harmful for us. And so that's what I help parents and families kind of incorporate into their home. And I will still be doing some of that, but I also am branching off and starting some intuitive life and business coaching because I love intuition and I love manifestation. And I have really kind of carved out a pretty unique life, I think, through intuition. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I certified through a company called the Life Coach School, and I've done a few other certifications since then. And as I really dove into shame and trauma and childhood and subconscious beliefs and all of these things, I realized that there was something deeper kind of under the surface than just like mindset coaching, where you just like talk
Mhm.
people through their thoughts. Not that that's not supportive, because it for sure is. And it was huge for me, but I just felt like there was something, this thread kind of woven below everything. And so that's when I kind of learned some other modalities that I feel like are really supportive with that. And so what I really work with people in doing, no matter what it is, arena that I'm working in, is helping them get to know themselves more and to accept themselves more. We often call that inner child healing or reparenting. And so whether the work is in your business or in your home and your relationship, that's the work that I love doing. Um, I got into it because I have a few neurodiverse kids that were really difficult to parent, and I read loads of books and went to loads of courses and did not feel like I could actually implement any of the things that I was learning. So it was through really doing things a different way and going inwards and doing my own inner healing that helped me to
Mhm.
to turn that around. And then in turn, my children's behavior improved drastically. Even the neurodiverse ones, without medication, without specific therapy modalities and stuff for them, there was nothing that we did with them. It was just me. So that's kind of my like coaching story. My life story is that I've been homeschooling for 11 years. My oldest son is in his last year of high school-ish, sort of. We don't do like set years, but around
Mhm.
his last year of high school. And we've been traveling and kind of on and off really our whole lives, our whole married life, I guess. It feels like my whole life. I've been married for a long time, 18 years. But on and off, travel has always been really, really important. And so we've been kind of transient since about 2017 and semi nomadic, which is kind of like moving from place to place. We stay places, usually like mid to long term.
Mhm.
And then we had this opportunity to potentially go travel the world for a year. We wanted to do it sometime in the future. And then it just kept getting pushed off. And then I was like, if we don't do it this year, my son might not even like come with us. And wouldn't that be a bummer for him to be like gone and be like, oh, look what my family is doing without me? So we decided to do it, even though we felt wholly unprepared. And like it was like a 5-year plan. And we were like, well, I guess it's the this year plan. So we launched in September and we are traveling until May, and we are circumnavigating the whole globe. So we've just been going around from country to country. And we're currently in Vietnam. And so my husband and I both work online. We homeschool the kids ish. I mean, if you can even call it homeschooling while you're traveling, I'm like, feel like we're getting very little done, but learning some really cool life lessons. So that's my kind of more
Yeah.
life story outside of coaching.
Wow. Yeah. I bet that's a lot, homeschooling and traveling and all of that. Like, I think there's lessons learned that you just can't get that
Mhm.
in a school setting. I homeschooled for
Yeah.
2 years and I almost went crazy. So,
Yes, the first 2 years I
maybe
did too. Actually, by year 4, I was, like, ready to just be like, "This is not for me at all." And then my homeschooling facilitator was like, you don't have to do it the way that you're doing it. Like, you are making it hard on yourself. I grew up my dad was a public school teacher, and I grew up very public schooly. So I was doing it the way the public school system does it. And that is just horrific. If you're listening to this and you're like thinking about homeschooling, do not try to reinvent the public schooling model in your home, because it's the worst. And then by grade 5 or grade 6, I had kind of like leaned back a little bit and really changed things. And so by grade 6 and grade 7, I was like, I feel like I'm talking about my grade 6 and grade 7, but my oldest child, 6th and 7th year, we completely changed our approach. And the last 6 years have been lovely. So, but we do it a very, very different way than any way, I think. And I think that's made the biggest difference with being able to make it sustainable. And also just lowering my expectations, like even while traveling, because like I thought my expectations were low before this, but I'm like, on days when, we like the other day when we go to check into our Airbnb, it's not working out and it takes us like 3 days to find a place. And anyways, I'm like, well, I'm not getting a lot of education this week, but that's okay.
They help solve problems. They'll be like expert travelers and navigators.
Expert travelers. They really will be. And to your point of like, they learn things that they would never learn. I'll just share one quick little story. There's so many stories that I could share already, but one is we were with our driver. We hired this driver for the day. He's taking us out places. He comes and picks us up at the end of the day. It's very inexpensive to do that in Southeast Asia. And so we're hanging out with him. He has Google Translate on his dashboard. So he was really chatty. So we're talking back and forth over Google Translate, which is hilarious in itself, because sometimes he'll say something and all of the children will burst out laughing. And he's like, okay, that obviously did not translate well. Anyways, so we're chatting with him about just his life, because he was asking us about our life. Like, how do we do this? Why are our kids not in school? I don't think homeschooling is a thing over here. Their kids, by the time you get to grade 6, are in school 6 days a week. We saw them at school at 7 a.m. When we were going to the airport. They were already like in their outfits. Everybody wears like the same thing at 7 a.m. And we saw them leaving at about 4 p.m.
Oh, wow.
So school is really important to them. They said that they hardly ever get any days off. Anyway, so we're talking to our driver who has a 2-year-old son, and he says he works 30 days out of the month. He said that he works 15-hour days, that he wakes up before his son is awake, and he goes to bed every night after his son is in bed.
How sad.
I'm going to tear up already, and we're not even talking about anything to do with our interview. But anyways, I said, well, how do you see your son? And because his wife also works 10-hour days, and she makes $200 Canadian a month, by the way. This is 10-hour days. And he said, oh, while I'm waiting for customers like you, I get to talk to him over video. And I was like sitting, having this conversation with him while my kids are hearing in the background. And we got done and pulled over. And my son was like, he doesn't ever get to see his dad. And I was like, yeah, that's pretty hard, hey? And I just thought, telling somebody that story is so different than being there, being present with that happening. And things like that have happened over and over and over again. Yeah. So even though I feel like I am ultimately failing at whatever homeschooling is right now while we travel, there's definitely experiences that we're having that are just that we would never, ever be able to have in other situations. So,
wow. Yeah. Definitely an understanding of, I think a lot of us, like I live in a little town and it's a bubble. We don't know what's going on in the whole majority of the world. And so that's a huge experience and life lesson to see that, these people are working every day, all day just to survive. And it's a huge.
And family is just so important to us, right? Like, I mean, obviously in what you do and like in the small little towns that we spend most of our time in, right? Family is like just so core. And so anyways, there's been lots of little things like that have happened where I just realized how blessed we really are to be able to be in an environment where we get to spend so much time together as a family. And ultimately that is why I decide to homeschool, even though some days I'm like, why? Like, why do I want to spend all day with my entire family? But
yes.
Anyways, it is a lovely and beautiful choice to be able to have. So yeah, there's a totally side note, random, not to do with our podcast episode, but I feel like it has to do with families.
Yeah. So I'm curious, you are living life differently than most people do, like So what kind of led you to that? Have you always been a person that like wants to do things different, or like how, I guess, were you raised that way, or is it just
Mhm.
you and your husband together? You're like, "Hey, we can actually live life how we want to."
Mhm. That's a good
I don't
question.
know.
I think when I was younger, I really strived to fit in.
Hmm.
I think that I looked at people around me and I was like, that's how I'm supposed to be. I remember when I was younger having my friends be like, "Oh no, you don't dress like that." And they like took me to their homes, showed me how to dress, was like, "No, no, no, you have to do your hair like this." And I was like, "Oh, okay." I feel like most of my growing up years were very much like, "Oh, is there a way to live that I'm not living like? And now how am I supposed to live like that?" And figuring out how to mold myself in there and just really please other people and what they
Hmm.
wanted. And to the to the detriment of me, right? Not really knowing myself or what I wanted. I've always known that travel was something important to me.
Hmm.
We didn't travel when I was little. We have a huge family and my single income home. So travel was not something that we got to do. I always really found joy in like even the little bits that we did, like going camping trips or family reunions or whatever. But I always just knew that that was something I wanted to do. So as soon as I graduated, I was like, I'm going to figure out how to travel. And so it's always been something that we've done in whatever ways we can.
Hmm.
My husband's always been pretty on board with that as well. But I think that the important decisions in my life that have really led me to a completely different lifestyle than other people didn't come so easily. Like homeschooling, for instance, I didn't know people that homeschooled. I didn't have friends growing up that homeschooled. I had
Hmm.
zero idea about homeschooling. There was not a community of homeschoolers around me. I just read Gordon Newfeld's book, Hold On to Your Kids. And I was just thinking about attachment. And I was like, I would love to have them home for a couple of years so I can just
Hmm.
work on our attachment. And it kind of felt right. Like it just felt deep in my gut, like the right thing for us. But it felt really scary because nobody else was doing it.
Hmm.
And Brené Brown has this book called Braving the Wilderness. And she says, like, it kind of feels like you're going out at it alone. Like you're going to be the only one out in this giant wilderness where it's like just you doing life really different. And that's what it felt like when I started homeschooling. And I know over time you learn more and you find community and whatever. But
Hmm.
every time that I've decided to step outside of whatever the box is, it has felt like that every time. It's never felt like, oh, I want to do something really different than everybody else's so that I don't fit in. But it's been like, oh, shoot, like this isn't my way. Like this isn't my way of being. This is not my life. This is the life that somebody told me to live somehow, subconsciously. And like, I don't actually want to live that kind of life. And so a lot of it came with just thinking about what do I want for us? What do I want
Right.
for my family? And I just innately wanted to spend more time with my kids. It just seemed so strange to send them off when they were so little to spend time with all these other people. So I was like, I'll just do it for a few years. But
Hmm.
not even just homeschooling, but starting my business or my husband deciding that he was going to start his, which was really wild because he had very few clients and we were like, we're just going to both be working online anyways and travel too. Like I think, and parenting, like the way that I parent is not the way that people
Hmm.
around me parent. It is not what I was modeled when I grew up. It is not the way my friends growing up did it. It is not the way that I see very many people doing it at all. And so I think it's so much of it is like breaking out of this mold of like, this is the way that I feel like it should be done versus like, this is how people tell me to do it. Anyway, so I think it's been like my own spiritual expansion journey of like, you know what? The way that it's being done isn't the way for you. Are you going to
Hmm.
be brave enough to go do it a way that nobody else is doing it and feel like exactly like I remember reading her book and thinking, she's like sharing my soul here. Like that's how it feels every time you really break out of the mold.
Hmm.
So, anyways,
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think I took some classes from Gordon Neufeld. I think you might have been there at some of them
Mhm,
in
mhm.
Raymond.
Yep, yep.
Yeah, and I remember like hearing him speak and how to parent. I was like, yes, this feels right.
Yes. Right?
Everything out, like I took this other course before that. I'm like, this just feels like you're training dogs. Like that's not how you.
Exactly.
That's not how you treat your children. So,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I'm
I
glad
feel
that
the same
you.
way. And but then like once I went through years of that, taking courses and reading and learning, and I even met him, went to courses live,
Mhm.
but didn't feel like it ever changed my parenting. Maybe it did like really little, but it really was doing a very different kind of work that changed my parenting.
Oh, cool. All right. Well, I want to hear a bit about your family. So were you
Mm.
close with like your grandparents or aunts and uncles and things when you grew up?
I would say grandparents, no. My grandparents on my maternal side have 66 grandkids, 66, 64, something like
Oh,
that.
wow.
And so it just wasn't, not that I didn't like feel that they loved me, because I did, but we didn't see them a ton. It wasn't like they were like writing us birthday cards or calling
Mm,
us on our birthdays, because there was just such a big family.
mm,
I remember being at a family reunion one time and complaining to my mom that there was only 2 cousins born in my birth year and everybody else had like 5 cousins in their birth year, and I didn't get along with my 2 birth year cousins, so, like, why couldn't there be somebody else for me? Because if for me, family was just this, like, giant, like, basically a school, right, when you got
mhm,
together, which I just laugh at now because my husband has 2 cousins on one side and, like,
mhm.
4 maybe on the other, 5 on the other, and I was like, "Total? What?" And anyways, I just remember being
Yeah.
feeling so, like, upset when I was little that, like, there just wasn't enough. Anyway, so I love the times that we got together for sure, but it is difficult growing up in a huge family like that and feeling really connected to anybody.
Mm,
I really do feel like I connected well with my aunts on that side, though. They are just loving humans. Every single
mhm,
one of them is just, like,
mhm.
a lovely person. I mean, you know them. They're
Yes,
like
I know one of them
right?
very well.
They're so lovely. So, definitely being around them, feeling very connected to them for
Mhm,
sure. But as far as, like, grandparents, loved them, yes. Felt loved by them, yes. I didn't get to spend very
mhm.
much time at all. In their later years, my mother-in-law took care of my grandma for the
Oh,
last several
wow.
years of her life and was there when she passed away.
Mm.
So, we kinda like to call her like a death doula or something. She's done this a few times for
Oh,
people, but
wow.
she's really wonderful at being able to help support people in the last years of their life. So, I actually got to see her way more when my
Mhm,
kids were little. Like, my kids have probably spent more time with her. She's
mm,
passed away now, but more time with her than I did
mhm.
because of just being in physical proximity. My dad's side of the family, very different. I think he was basically kicked out. Like, his parents just were
Oh,
like, "You can't live here anymore." Kind of by the time you got to whatever age, 18, 19, 20, they were like, "It's over." They
mm,
didn't have a great relationship, and so we never saw them. He
mm.
moved across the country. They lived in Eastern Canada. I remember seeing them, like, less than a handful of times
Oh,
before I
wow.
turned 18, like, very few.
Mm,
And then when I was 14, my dad finally agreed to let me fly out there and, like, visit my family,
mm,
and I did, and I stayed with my grandma, and it was a totally new experience to me because I really didn't know her.
mhm.
A little bit uncomfortable, but it was still nice to kind of feel like I was getting to know her, and then I went back home and she got hit by a car 3 days later.
Oh, wow.
So, anyway, so
Mm,
I don't feel like I got to know her that well. Some of my siblings feel a little bit more connected, I think, to my grandparents, but I didn't feel like I had a very deep connection
mhm.
with any of them, probably because of the time thing, just
Right, right.
not seeing them a lot, not knowing even a lot about them. I feel like this comes up a lot in the work that I do is that people didn't, like, talk about things, you know? It's like
Mhm,
if we had problems, we, like, shove them down, we pretend like everything's fine on the outside, and we never talk
mhm.
about them.
Yeah.
So I'm constantly surprised when people will share, like, family stories and just kinda be like, "Well, don't you know that?" And I was like, "What? How would I know? Nobody ever talks about anything. How?" And so I've enjoyed getting to know cousins and relatives and stuff in my adult years and hearing
Mhm.
stories that I hadn't heard before, but
Right.
yeah.
Oh, cool. All right. Well, when I reached out to you, you said that you wanted to learn about your
Mhm,
paternal grandmother's parents, right?
mhm.
I think that was right.
I think so,
Hopefully.
yeah. I mentioned a few, but that was definitely one of
Yes,
the
that was
lines I
one of
wanted to
them.
learn more
Yes.
about.
Yeah, you mentioned one of your great grandmothers on the other side. But
Mhm,
so Emerson Stapleton Baker and Antoinette Saucier. I think
mhm.
that's how you would say it in French.
Yes, I actually think that I've seen their stones when we went to Ontario one time for a family reunion. We There's, like, a
Oh,
tiny
okay.
little town with where they're buried, yeah.
Oh, cool. So I'm just wondering why, or if you can share with us why you were interested in that family. Like what
Mm.
kind of
I
made you
think
think
there's
I want to
so
learn
little
about them?
known about my grandma. She was just, like, a feisty lady, very difficult, like, abusive mostly, I think,
Mm,
in how she reacted, and I don't know, I wish that I knew more about her. I'm sure there was some
Mm-hmm.
like neurodiversity or some trauma or something that made her the way that she was. So we kind of grew up not entirely estranged, but definitely not connected. And it just felt like there was probably something there. And when I would talk
Yeah.
to aunts and uncles about it, they would never say like, "Oh, she's a terrible person" or anything, but there was just never a lot of conversation. But to me, it always felt like there's gotta be something more that made I just think there's always something behind people's human behavior,
Yeah.
right? If well,
Yeah.
whatever we see on the outside, there's a reason for it on the
Yeah.
inside.
Yeah.
And I just don't know a lot about her, especially because she died when I was 14. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not a relationship that I had the opportunity to try and grow and learn
Mm-hmm.
more about.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to share with you a bit about her parents, and hopefully you can see those slides. Can you see
Mhm.
that now?
Yeah.
Okay. So your great grandmother, Antoinette Sarah Saucier, and there's some French names in here, so hopefully I do them
Mhm.
justice, but I did take French in junior high. She was born on the 30th of January, 1915 in Ottawa, Ontario. She was the fourth child born to Olivier and Georgiana Saucier. Her two older sisters had died before she was born. They died, like, as a toddler, and she had one older brother. So this red spot here on the map is the home that they were living in when she was born. So this is in Ottawa, Ontario. Have you visited there before?
I have, yeah. I
Yeah.
have not
Yes.
not heard not this spot, but I have been to
Right.
Ottawa, but I didn't even
Yeah.
know that that's where she was born.
Yeah. So that's where she was born. And like here's the Byward Market, and like the
Mhm.
Parmalee Hill is over here. So not too far from downtown there. So she was born, and on her birth certificate, it says that her father's occupation was painter. And then here is in the 1921 census, Olivier and Georgiana, they were living in Ottawa still. They now had 3 living children. 2 more children were born before the census but died before the census. The oldest son here, Romeo, was 11. Antoinette, your great-grandmother, right here in the yellow, she was 6, and then Raoul was 4. Olivier and Georgiana had 13 children total, but only 7 lived to adulthood. Yeah, so Antoinette is your great-grandmother, so Olivier and Georgiana would be your second great-grandparents. So in the 1921 census, they lived at 160 Murray Street in Ottawa, which looks like it's been torn down now, and there's a parking garage there. And they lived in right near the Byward Market. So I don't know if you've been there before, but they lived at this address here. Here's Parliament Hill is right over here. Here's the Byward Market, and it's quite a bustling place in Ottawa. This is what it would have looked like in the 1920s when they would have lived there. So they would have lived just like a couple blocks from here. By 1931, they were renting this home in London, Ontario, 500 kilometers away, for $15 a month. And this is so they had a few more children now. Olivier was a paper hanger for a contractor. So I think he like did wallpaper for building houses and things. So
Mhm.
painter, he was probably a painter, like house painter. And then paper hanger was his occupation here in 1931. It said that he made $565 in 1931, which I checked online with inflation is supposedly just around 10,000 in that year. He was unemployed for 25 weeks in 1931. So they had 6 children at home. Their oldest son, Romeo, had moved. He would have been 21 by then. But here's Antoinette Sarah. She was 17. And she worked as a domestic servant, it said, and she had made $59.50 that last
Mhm.
year. The youngest, Olivier Joseph Robert, was 4 here, and he's actually not in your family tree on Family Search. But that could be because whenever people added him in, he might have still been living because he would be about 97 now. So we
Mm.
could do some more research and see if he's still living, and if not, you can add him into your family tree. But
Okay.
and then the family must have moved to the US for a time because you can see the 3 youngest children. It says USA here. That's their birthplace. So they were born in the US. So the family must have left around 1924 to 1927, living in the US somewhere. So, what do you think it would have been like for this family? Father was obviously not making very much
Mhm.
money. They had 6 children at home, the oldest is 17, the youngest of 4. They actually lost some children. They had lost 5 children already, and
Mhm.
yeah, what do you think it would have been like for this family?
Yeah, I think what stuck out to me was how many kids had died as well, and, like, the
Mhm,
impact that that would have on you as parents.
mhm,
And, like, obviously, there's something like, this is not going to be an easy life if you're making so little out of work a lot. Like, there was probably something going on there to make it yeah, it just seems like there's obviously a story there, and it's
mhm,
so interesting to just think about. Um, I love learning about generational trauma, and I think that so many things are passed down to us, and, like, I think that wonderful gifts and amazing things are passed down to us as well, but it's interesting just to see, like, I wonder what their, like, day-to-day lives would have been like. Like, I
mhm,
wonder what is really going on with them.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, so this is actually where they would have lived at that time. It's been
Mhm.
torn down, but there was this beautiful Anglican church right behind them. Now, they weren't Anglican, they were Roman Catholic, but they lived, like, in near downtown London, Ontario at this time. Right. So now about 3 years later, in 1934, Antoinette, so that your great-grandmother, who was 17
Mhm.
in that 1931 census, she married Harvey Edwin Stapleton when she was 19 and he was 25. They were living at 235 Ottaway Avenue in London, and that was their marriage record
Mhm.
there. And then this is the witness is Mr. Olivier Saucier, so Antoinette's father, who also lived at 235 Ottaway Avenue, London, Ontario.
Mhm.
So they were living with her father. Antoinette's mother had died 2 years earlier, and there were probably a few more siblings living at home because the youngest would have been 9. And the couple, Harvey and Antoinette, already had their first child who was 4 months old at the time
Mhm.
when they were married.
Mhm.
And this is likely the home that they lived in. The research that I did said that Ottaway Avenue is now South Street in London, Ontario, and this would have been their address. I assume this was their house, other homes in the area. It said they were built in, like, the late 1800s, early
Mhm.
1900s, so I think this would actually be the house that they lived in 1934 at the time that they were married. So, it's not a very
Wow.
big house. They would have
Mhm.
been pretty full with, her father and them and their baby and then some other siblings still at home.
Mhm.
And actually on that marriage says that Harvey was a painter decorator. So I wonder if he worked with her father because he was doing kind of similar work.
Mhm.
And then here is a picture that was on Family Search, and it says it's Antoinette and Harvey. Said it was from 1924, but I know that that's not right because she would have been 9 years old. And so,
But
um,
time's not right, yeah.
yeah, so and it looks like they're probably, like, in their 30s or 40s, so it would have been a little later than that, but,
Yeah, she
um
looks like my grandma.
does she?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, they look really similar.
So Harvey and Antoinette had at least 4 children. The girl here is your grandmother, Elizabeth. And then they must have divorced sometime before 1959 when she married Alexander McDougall. So I tried to find information about, like, their divorce or anything like that, and
Mhm.
I even tried to find Harvey later, and I couldn't really find much. There is, at least on Family Search, they had someone's put a headstone of him, but his name is Emerson Baker, which well, that was his birth
Mm.
name. So I'm like, I feel like there needs to be a little more digging to make sure that that's right,
Mhm.
but yeah. So here are those 4 children, and notice that on your tree it says his name was Emerson Stapleton Baker, so that was what his
Mhm.
birth name was. So, I was curious about this because when they're married, his name is Harvey Edwin Stapleton. I'm like, "Why why
Mhm.
would he have a different name? Like, why?" That's kind of weird. So, did some digging. Some of these records are already on Family Search on your family tree, but some I found, like some censuses and things. So here's his birth record. You can see his name was Emerson Stapleton Baker. He was born February 7th, 1910 in Wingham Township, Ontario. His father was Olivier Stapleton, and his father was a stove mounter. Not sure what that is. Maybe like installed stoves. I don't know. And then his mother was Martha Baker. They were not married. And if you scroll down on that birth record at the bottom of the page, can you read what that says?
Illegitimate.
Illegitimate. Okay, so they were not married at the time that Emerson, or later named Harvey, was born. And that would explain, a bit of his name changes maybe as we dive into it a little bit more. So this record's really hard to read, but this is in 1911. Harvey, or he's actually recorded as LV here. He was living with his grandmother, which is really hard to read. It says Mrs. Charles Baker. I don't know if you can see that. So her husband had died. Martha's father had died by then. So there's Mrs. Charles Baker, and then Martha, and then Mabel is Martha's sister, and then there's Stanley, and then there's a Harry that says grandson, and LV that says grandson. And this Stanley actually says grandson too, but I think he's actually the son. There's some interesting things there too, but we're not going to worry about Stanley. So Harry and LV were Martha's sons. And we're going to look at them a little deeper. So here is Harry's. It's a late birth registration. So either they didn't register his birth when he was born, or it was lost, or whatever. I couldn't find an original one, but here's a late birth registration for him, and it just says Harry Baker, his birth date in 1907. There's no name of a father. And now Martha Cooley. So she had married by the time that they did this in 1941, I think it was. So this was before Emerson or Harvey was born. So then in 1921, I was looking for Harvey to find out where he was. So in 1911, both Harvey and Harry, or Emerson, it's confusing. Harvey is Emerson. They were living with their mother. But in 1921, Emerson, or now he's going by Harvey, is living with his grandfather's brother, Emmanuel Stapleton. So on Family Search, he's linked to them, like he's listed as one of their children. He's listed as either stepchild, or I can't remember what it is, or guardianship or something. Anyway, so Harvey has, his biological parents listed on there, and then he's also under this Emmanuel Stapleton and Mabel. Mabel is was raised, well, that's the wife, yeah. Mabel is the mother that he would have been raised as. So Harvey here was 11, and his adopted father, I guess, would be Emmanuel, and he was a farmer. And they lived in Wawanoosh, Ontario. It's like kind of a bit northwest of Toronto. So then I was trying to find where Harry was, and he was adopted by Ernest and Alberta Bender. This information is also on Family Search, but the census wasn't there, so I found them in the census. So here you can see Ernest Bender and Alberta Bender, and then Harry Baker, and it says adopted son here. So he was 14 at this time, and then they also had a son, Ernest Bender. So, yeah, what do you think your great-grandfather's childhood might have been like? So by the time he was 11, he was living with his great-uncle and was a farmer in a rural little place. His mother was not there, was not living with his mom anymore, or his brother. What do you think that might have been like for him?
Yeah, I wonder what his life was as a child, because to have to live with somebody different and then also have your little brother adopted by presume this isn't like a connected family member. This is just like
I couldn't find the
a
connection
random.
other than Alberta lived close to Wawanoosh, where she was born in
Mhm.
Wawanoosh. So I'm like, maybe they were related somehow, but I couldn't see anything obviously.
Yeah.
Um,
Like, yeah, it seems like obviously there was a lot of, it was obviously really difficult for them because that doesn't seem like a usual kind of
mhm,
situation or a way
mhm,
to do it. So,
mhm.
yeah, it just makes me curious about, again, like what's really going on, like what's happening in their day-to-day life that's making it like this.
Yeah. Yeah. So now we're going to look a little bit at Emerson or Harvey's mother and Harry's mother, Martha Baker. So this would be your second great grandmother. Okay. So Martha Baker, she was the eighth child born to Charles and Elizabeth Baker. This is her birth record here. Charles was a farmer in Roxeter, Ontario, up here. So you can see
Mhm.
it's probably not very populated up there. And
Mhm.
um, in the 1901 census, he was a farmer on his own land now. Before that, he was a farm laborer on other people's land, I guess. And Martha now had two younger siblings and was 12 years old. In 1918, Martha married Charles Molson in Toronto. She was 26 and he was 27. So Emerson or Harvey, your great grandfather would have been 8 years old when they got married, and Harry would have been 11. So maybe this was when they were adopted or left to live with his great uncle.
Mhm.
Maybe her husband didn't want her kids around. I don't know. They were from a
Mhm.
different man. Who knows what that relationship was like, but from that point on, they weren't living with them. The only time we have those two boys living with their mom is in 1911 is what we
Mhm.
see. And then 1921, they're living with other people. So that's likely what happened. So in the 1921 census, Charles and Martha were living at 174 Drummond in Brantford, Ontario, about 100 kilometers south of where her boys lived. Martha's mother was also living with them, and Charles was a brickmaker, and they rented their home. So this is likely the home. This is the address. When looks like it could be a house that was built before 1921, but
Mhm.
we don't know for sure. And then Charles died in 1934 from cancer at the age of 44. So you can see that,
Mhm.
yeah, Charles Molson. And then I feel like her name was on here somewhere.
Oh, yeah,
Little.
Mar
Oh, there at the bottom. Martha Matilda Molson. There we go. Yeah. So he died of cancer in 1934. So they had only been married for about
15 years or
how
something.
long is it? 1918 to 1934. Not too long.
Yeah.
So then Martha, can you see that? Like
Yeah.
not showing up on my, okay. Martha
Yeah.
married John James Cooley 3 years later in 1937, and he was also widowed, and they were living in Brantford, Ontario by this time.
Mm.
And then you can see on that marriage record, this is her signature. It says Mrs. Martha Molson. So this was, just before they were married. She would have been Cooley now after she got married. So this is her signature on the marriage document. By this time, her son Harvey, or Emerson as he was born, would have been married and living in London, Ontario, about 85 kilometers away. So I'm not sure if she ever contacted her son after he stopped living with her sometime between 1911 or 1921. But her second husband died in 1948, and then she lived until 1975 and died when she was 86.
Mhm.
And here is her headstone. You can see it's Molson there. When we zoom in, you can see Charles Molson. So that's her first husband. And
Mhm.
Martha M. Molson. And then actually her second husband, John Cooley, is also buried here.
Mm.
So then here is her obituary. It doesn't mention any children. And so I am
Mm.
thinking that her and uh, either of her husbands likely didn't have children. I don't know for sure because I wasn't able to find anything in like the later on it's harder to get records because of privacy laws, like
Mhm.
after the 1920s. But just says at the Bethel Nursing Home on Friday, August 1st, 1975, Martha M. Baker, predeceased by her first husband, Charles Molson, and her second husband, Jack Hewley, beloved aunt of Mrs. Winifred Seary and of Petawawa and Mrs. Alma Heimer of Brantford. And it doesn't list any children or any other relatives. So I'm guessing that they didn't have any other children because there is that late birth record for Harry in 1941. There must have been some sort of contact because she would have had to, like, he would have had to contact her to get that late birth record. But we don't know for sure what their relationship was like, or if they were in contact with their children and grandchildren or whatever. But that is what I have to share with you about your family.
Mm.
So what are you feeling right now as you learned a bit more about your great grandparents and a bit about their
I feel like
lives?
it makes sense with just little clips of things that I've heard over the years. And I think that, again, going back to trauma, like there was probably something going on there, like alcoholism or addiction or something that was kind of woven through that because I think what stood out to me was like in the death announcement that there wasn't any children listed, even though she did have children, obviously. So she must have separated herself from them pretty
Mhm.
significantly in order for that not to be listed on
Mhm.
the obituary. So I wonder what that was like. And I also just like learning about more about women's rights and issues and stuff, right? I think that being an unwed mother at that time would have been like a huge no. And
Mhm.
also, you couldn't even own a bank account by yourself
Mhm.
until like 1975. So I wonder how much of it she wanted versus like what she felt like she had to do or
Mhm.
whatever. Like, yeah, it's
Mhm.
interesting to like, because we see such little tidbits,
Mhm.
from information to really be like, I wonder what that was like. Like, I wonder what
Mhm.
was really happening that made her make those choices.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think sometimes it's hard to see because you're like, how could she let her boys leave? Or, especially when she remarried, why wouldn't she take them back?
Mhm.
But we don't know, and we can assume that maybe her new husband didn't want them or
Mhm.
whatever, but or maybe she didn't. We don't know. But
Mhm.
it can be hard, and I think as that boy, Harvey, as he went by later in life, like, that would have been probably a hard thing, and maybe that's why his marriage didn't work out or whatever, like, we don't know all the repercussions of being raised like
Mhm.
that, but, um, we do know that there are consequences to, feelings of abandonment or anything like that,
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
but yeah, I feel like
Yeah.
we,
That
like.
was, yeah. I feel like it always, like, on the outside, you can see things like addiction or whatever, right? But there's always something underneath the surface. And I think that trauma always like leaves an effect. And so being
Mhm,
little and even if they weren't, physically abandoned, even if she was like set them up with something really great or whatever,
mhm,
there's still going to be that emotional aspect of it. And then how it would have affected them growing
mhm,
up and then affected their children.
mhm,
And like I only know of it from my grandma, who
mhm,
I feel like I only knew very little but definitely seemed like she had a lot happening inside of herself.
mhm, yeah,
Um, yeah.
yeah. Well, I feel like we're, like, on a downer right now.
Mhm. Should we read a happy family Yeah, I think it's interesting because I like to learn like the work that I often do is like trying to help people heal subconscious beliefs that have been passed down to them that they might not even really know are there, right?
Mhm,
That have come down the line. And I love learning more of these kind of like physical, like information tidbits to be like,
mhm,
oh, yeah, like I can see where that may have come from,
mhm.
right?
Yeah,
Where I don't feel loved or I don't feel accepted or I don't feel seen or whatever have maybe been passed down. And sometimes when I'm doing belief work and I'm like, I love to just like write things out and see what kind of is coming out from my brain. And sometimes it surprises me because I'm like, "Oh, logically, I don't believe that at all." But one of the questions I like to ask myself is like, "Is this belief even mine?
mhm,
Like, is this somebody else's in the past?" And I think that a lot of them are from, right, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway, so
definitely.
it's really fascinating just to kind of see things woven together. And I think it helps give you a better understanding of your own people, right? Your own parents, your own
Hmm.
grandparents.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I think, what I've found is that and when we understand those things that maybe aren't ideal, those situations, it can allow us to give our ancestors grace,
Mhm.
you know, that they didn't
Mhm.
have life all figured out and things were dealt to them that were not great. And I like the idea of, is that thought mine, or is that from
Mhm.
something passed down from those ancestors before and something that they dealt with? Because
Mhm.
yeah, that's something that I've been diving into too as I am helping people understand their ancestors and their family tree, to see those stories and those experiences that might have caused trauma that's been passed down, and how that's
Mhm.
affecting them now, even though it's not their story.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think it really does affect us. And I think like there's more research around epigenetics now, how like things literally are passed down in our genes.
Mhm.
And so I think just always pausing to be like, wait, is this part of my story or not? And how do I want to rewrite my story? Even if it is kind of like outside the box, like our life is,
Yep.
like, how do I want to live my life and what beliefs do I want to take with me and which ones do I want to kind of leave to the side? And I also think acknowledging like strengths that were passed down, because I think that
Mhm.
there was a lot of that. Like, I think my grandma was probably a pretty strong person. I think she
Yep.
went through a really difficult childhood and life. And I feel like when I see kind of that side of it, it helps me have more compassion. Like
Mm.
you said, like grace for why they are the way that they are, because
Yep.
their lives were pretty difficult. It wasn't like you just shared this really cushy, like, oh, they had lots of money and lived in this beautiful house and had a great,
Mhm.
childhood. Like, that would have
Mhm.
been really, really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what I had to share with you today. You did mention this other, I think
Hmm.
it was your great-great-grandmother, that I was
Hmm.
gonna look at, but I'm like, "Well, I think we've got enough already." But she was a beautiful young woman, and, like, I wanna learn
Yeah.
about her, so maybe we'll have to do it again, but,
Yeah, maybe I'll have to do it
um
again. I just remember seeing so many photos of her in, like, pictures of like, my grandparents love to have, like, black and white
Mhm.
pictures on their wall, like, that set of grandparents.
Mhm.
Um, so anyways, I don't know much
It's
about my
interesting.
ancestry on that side either. I'm sure that more of my aunts and uncles do than I do,
Right.
but it's just interesting to hear little bits of, like,
Mhm.
where they lived and what their life was like, and
It
so
is.
this has been really interesting. Thank you
Yeah.
for researching all of that and sharing all of
Yeah.
that with me.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. How can people who are listening connect with you and learn more about your work and what you are doing?
What I do. So my website is coachcrystal.ca. I'm on Instagram a lot, so you can hang out with me there, the parenting coach, the .parenting.coach. I am starting a new Instagram as well, so I'll have an intuitive coaching Instagram. And then I have a podcast that's really fun called the Parenting Coach Podcast. So you can
Awesome.
listen in to all the things to do with parenting, motherhood, and also just life. So
Awesome. I will put all the links to those in the show notes. So, all right. Well,
thank
thank
you.
you so much, Crystal. And we'll see you guys
Thank
next
you.
time.
Thank you for doing all this research.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for listening to Know Your Ancestors today. If you want more help with your own family tree, learning how to look for records, getting unstuck, whether that's merging people on Family Search or learning how and where to look for records about your ancestor, I offer a VIP membership. It's a 3-month commitment where you can come and get help with your family tree every week in a live call. If you can't attend live, you can submit questions beforehand and I will answer them on the call. You can go to knowyouраncestors.co/VIP to sign up for that. Thanks again for listening to the podcast. I'd love for you to leave a rating and review and share this episode with your friends, and we'll see you next week.